Welcome to Awakening Mindfulness at Work, a conversation that matters. I'm Pierre
And I'm Sarah Killeen. We are bringing to you conversations and practices to cultivate presence, calm, and balance in the workplace.
Hello, Sarah. Today, I would like to explore a topic that seems like deceptively simple, but actually it could be a transformational one. And it's something related to some topics we talked about in the past, but it's a slightly different angle on this topic. And that is working in iterations. Yeah. So working in iterations can be a game changer, especially when we're facing tasks that may be too big, too overwhelming, maybe difficult. Maybe we're procrastinating for hours or for days or for months. So that's when it can be a real change and it can bring some amazing outcomes.
Pierre, can you say a little bit more? Can you describe what it would look like? What does working in iteration looks like,
Look
Because I
like,
guess, it
yeah.
look like a lot of different things. So just to make it clear as we start exploring that topic.
Yeah. So working in iteration means instead of taking on the whole thing, like the entire task, the entire project, the entire scary unknown thing, what if we just took one iteration, and that means a contained step. So, and I would like later to talk about the neuroscience of this, but let's start first with the practical thing and answering your question. So, an iteration is a clear has a clear boundary. So this means we put a little scope. So we limit the scope, or we could limit the time. We could say, okay, I'm working on this for 15 minutes or 30 minutes. Or the scope could be, I'm going to explore just this one part of this problem. Or my goal in this iteration is just to understand what's going on and get a lay of the land so I can be ready to do more. So yeah, so that's what I mean by it's putting the boundary, and I really appreciate that boundary setting. So the first iteration doesn't to be about finishing. Finishing would amplify the fear or the anxiety or the avoidance. So the first iteration is much more gentle and kind, and it's about exploring and understanding and getting in motion. So yeah, so
It's a bit the
tell
same
me.
concept as a draft, If you were say if you're trying to if you're, let's say, writing a book and you're trying to get
Hmm.
the perfect copy the first time you're writing, you'd be so paralyzed, right? It might be very overwhelming to the point that you actually cannot write anything
Hmm.
because there's this
Hmm.
fear of not being good enough, right? That if it's any less than perfect, then it won't be good enough to be shipped or shared or um yeah, so I like what you say as well about, I think iterations as well. If you look at the whole task, an iteration could also be not breaking down a task into smaller subtasks, but could be a V1, like the first version of a full task, which is a different kind
Hmm.
of boundary, right? So what I'm hearing from what you're sharing is we can define our own boundaries as well. So what is really important, that one iteration that I'm going to do, is it looking at the entirety of the whole, looking at the whole task and having a first pass to just get more familiar with all the different steps and all that the task will bring up? Or is it to take one part of the task and actually really dive deeper into that one part? So I guess you make your own boundaries,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
comes back to the concept of intentionality, right? Setting the intention.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, exactly. And I like to kind of add to that I think it's kind of thinking about ourselves as being the designer instead of being the doer. Like, oh, we need to go do this task. So thinking of ourselves, I'm the designer, and being a designer means to pause, step back, and think about what's at stake here, think about the big picture, think about what could be the approach, and then approach it more thoughtfully, and then take some action, but the action becomes much more thoughtful. So instead of being the doer, we're the designer, moving from the doer role. We're no longer the doer, we're the designer.
And when you say designer, I think, it really evokes very strongly a process, the concept of a process. It is a process, it is evolving rather than just getting something done, right? So that's I guess that's where more creativity can come up as well. If we're thinking about creative tasks, right? If we do focus on the process and that exploration without having that high standard of the outcome, it needs to look like this in the end, or it needs to be that kind of outcome. Then we might be surprised as we work on the task.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, truly. And related to what you mentioned earlier, I think one scenario could be, the first iteration is just flushing out ideas. Whatever is happening, all the ideas we have, including the thoughts and the feelings and the physical sensations that may be happening. So if there is like procrastination, or if there is some fear and anxiety, jotting it down too, observing it, and putting labels on it, and then putting also the ideas that relate to the content of the task. So having that first iteration be, let me just pour everything, whatever, electronically or on paper, whatever the context is. And that is a huge step in releasing all this and helping us then design what could be a first next iteration.
Mm. Now, some people might ask, well, this sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like the task could take a lot more time than it would. Which is a question we've heard before, right? In some of our workshops, this sounds like a lot of work. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say to that, it is some work, but it's a lot more work when we don't do it, because then all this information is mixed up in our head, and it's likely to be much more difficult and causing probably more, um, less focus, being more distracted by all these things that are happening. And also, if we're not feeling, if we don't have that feeling of calm and feeling grounded, it's not going to be easy to tackle the task and to make progress. So I think, yeah, this is a great point you bring up, and we hear this quite often. Like when we talk, in one of our workshops, we have something called the immediate priorities matrix, which is a tool to help people sort out, what's happening in their world in the next week or two, and to have much more thoughtful approach to how to go about it. And people say sometimes, oh, I don't have time to do this. And my answer typically is, if you don't have time to do this, that really means you need to do it. You need to stop for 10 minutes. It all takes 10 minutes, and calm down and be in a position to approach those with being a little more strategic and thoughtful, and so forth. Because if you don't have time to do those things that we're describing, that means we're likely to be running around, from one thing to the next, probably not having the time to think more, strategically, and also we're probably working in a stressed way, which is not very productive, and we're probably not paying enough attention to what's going on, and to people, and to relationships. So yeah, so if we don't have time to do this, that means we really want to consider stopping, and
Mm.
shifting the energy.
Yeah. I really like this metaphor of the ladder against the wall. I think it's, if you can be working, you can be climbing a ladder extremely efficiently, really fast, being really productive, and then you arrive at the top and you realize the ladder was against the wrong wall. So you're not much further away. You're not much. You haven't made a lot of progress. So I think everything you're sharing everything you just shared was pointing to that a little bit, making sure that we are climbing, well, the right ladder, or that the ladder that we are climbing is against the right wall. Otherwise we won't make meaningful progress to what really matters to us. So, and because very often, and I know you're going to speak a little bit about the neuroscience behind it, when we are acting from a place of overwhelm, right? We are overwhelmed. So what am I going to do next? If I'm overwhelmed, we we might not be, like you're saying, we just might not be going in the right direction, because of this sense of urgency, maybe of just, going through, or just, I just want to be on the other side, so I'll just do whatever it takes for me to feel like I'm on the other side, and I'm out of this pickle. And this might not be what actually matters, at the end of the day. um
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. Yeah. And talking about the neuroscience, so something very interesting happens when we begin an iteration. So basically, just the fact that we started to do thoughtfully think about what's happening and reflect, we're immediately engaging the part of our brain and nervous system that's much more responsible for our, critical thinking, for our thoughtfulness, for problem solving, creativity. And that by itself also calms down or deactivates the middle part of the brain, the one that fuels, fear and anxiety and avoidance. So just that small shift of getting into that iteration is not just a behavioral change, it's a neurological change, it's an emotional change, and our mood is likely to soften, and our ability to focus and think creatively is likely to open up. So yeah, so our body will, and our body and our mind and everything starts to open up and to flow. Yeah.
that reminds me of another episode we recorded as well, when we were talking about flexibility within a container of discipline. I think in that sense, boundaries are that discipline. They give us that structure. So everything we're talking about today, in this episode, we're talking about a process, right? We're talking. It's almost like an operating system. How do we define that process? This process is this container, is this structure that allows us then to feel more secure in, right? Because we know where it starts, where it ends, what the scope is. There's a little bit less certainty in terms of the environment of the task, which means that then we feel more free and light. We feel lighter and more free to explore when we are within it, rather than using the actual process of working as the structure, which by definition it
Mhm.
cannot be the structure unless we are absolutely not creative at all, right?
Yeah. So in essence, what you just described, that this brings together the both the discipline and the flexibility. So a little bit of discipline, because that container, this iteration is our discipline. Now I have a little bit of a structure, but then because we're the designer and we're designing that container, we have the flexibility to work with it in whatever way we feel like it would support us right now. But in addition, within that container, now we can be free to be creative and yeah, to show what can be done, and yeah, so it's a very nice way to combine the two.
Hmm. And so another question I think people might have is, when do you know you're finished? I mean, because iterations could be forever, right? And I think that we might go into another topic and another episode now, which we'll definitely do. But in
Yeah,
that sense, we could just never be finished, because
yeah.
iterations could go on forever until we're 100% happy, and until it's perfect, and there's always something we can do better and improve. So yeah, what would you
When you
reply?
know you're done. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that can be hard for, for those of us who are perfectionists, because we can keep perfecting. We can keep going through more iterations to perfect. Yeah, and this is, I think the answer here is to be mindful and stepping back and assessing, thoughtfully, what is the goal, and how can I am I achieving um, enough of the goal that I can declare this is completed. So yeah, it does take some judgment and some keep checking,
Mm.
stepping back. And this is where sometimes I think reaching out to people to get some additional perspective can be helpful, especially if we feel like we're caught into that reiterating. That's when we might want to reach out. And yeah, this reminds me of something we talk about in design thinking. We call it bias to action, which means um, as soon as possible, putting our work out there, taking the action and putting our work out there and getting feedback instead of reiterating indefinitely until it's perfect before we share it and put it out there. So that could help, help us make that
Mm.
distinction.
I think, I mean, that's wonderful, and I think it's really difficult to do that unless someone has the core confidence that they are, safe doing that. And I mean, there's so much underneath,
Hmm. Hmm.
looking around, people who might not necessarily feel safe enough, or not feel really afraid, feel really scared of putting something out there before they have assessed that it was perfect or that it was quote unquote good enough for them. Because what is good enough, which is another conversation. But I think there's this confidence underneath, and again, this would be another topic, so we might not go into that one today. But I think recognizing that there is so much more underneath as well. There are a lot of emotions, there are a lot of beliefs, and some of them are very limiting as well. There's a whole set of forces, there's a whole set of elements under those very practical decisions and processes that you've just shared as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and this means this is something we always seem to come back to, that for any of this to be meaningful and useful, there is a level of mindfulness and awareness that are needed. And that's where, back to our mindfulness practices, that's why they are so fundamental, and um they show up everywhere. So one more related thing I want to mention before we wrap up, and that is, sometimes starting the smallest iteration, we may be resisting to that. um, and that resistance may not allow us to even start an iteration, the first iteration. So I have an idea about that, and that is having the first iteration be simply exploring the resistance, and being with the resistance, and kind of related to what you said, Sarah, to look into what's behind it, what's underneath it, give that some attention, some kindness, some compassion, and then move into designing the first iteration. So resistance cannot be
Mm.
ignored, because it can really took us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I think a key element of that is this ability to let go of expectations, to a certain
Mhm.
degree, letting go of expectations and letting go of that pressure to get to that outcome, right?
Yeah.
So again, self awareness really helps there. Mindfulness or mindfulness practices and different tools and little practices we've shared really do help there. And it's a lifelong journey, as we keep saying. Right? It's just like iterations. You just keep practicing, you keep trying, you keep exploring, and yeah, that's the beauty of it, I guess. So, what else would you say, Pierre? How do we wrap up?
It's an invitation for our listeners to take one of your important priorities this week and just sitting down, designing your first iteration and approaching it like an exploration. And then when you do that first iteration, just reflecting on what's the next one. So really putting that working in iterations in practice and see how it feels. Journal about it, reflect. How did it feel? And see what insights might come up.
Great. Happy exploring.